everyone, and welcome to the virtual launch of the Conflict Textiles exhibition at the Macleay Library, Queen's University Belfast. Thank you all for joining us today. It's great to have people from all over the place, as well as, of course, from Queen's. So I am Dr. Lauren Dempster. I'm a lecturer in the School of Law here at Queen's, and I've been working with Roberta Batchich and Briege Doherty of the Conflict Textiles Archive to bring this exhibition to Queen's. So just to note again for anyone who's just arrived, if you could please keep your microphone on mute and your video off unless you're speaking. So our speakers today will each make a contribution of about 5 minutes. So we have Professor Brandon Humber after I speak, then Roberta Batchich, and then Deborah Stockdale. And finally, we'll have some comments from Dr. Cheryl Lother and Professor Kieran McAvoy. At the end, then we'll have some time for discussion. So in terms of how this exhibition came about, last August, the Conflict Textiles Archive had organised following the footsteps of the disappeared online exhibition, and they had some events to coincide with the International Day of the Disappeared. So my own PhD research was on the disappearances that were perpetrated during the conflict in Northern Ireland. And so Kath Collins and Brandon Humber from Ulster had put me in touch with Roberta and Briege ahead of that, ahead of the Following in the Footsteps exhibition. Subsequently then, we recorded a Law Pod episode with Roberta and Briege on the Conflict Textiles Archive generally, but specifically the Following the Footsteps exhibition. And then at some point after that, Roberta asked about the possibility of having an exhibition at Queen's, and the exhibition is now in place. So that's the result of a few months of work. So there's a number of thank yous that I would like to make in terms of the people who have supported the exhibition so far. So thank you to the Human Rights Centre of the School of Law and its director, Cheryl Lother, and thank you also to the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Justice and Security, and Professor Hastings Donnan, its director, for supporting the installation. I also want to thank Dr. Lother for agreeing to speak today, and thank you also to Professor Kieran McAvoy, who is here today representing the Mitchell Institute, as Hastings could not make it, unfortunately. So I also want to thank Queen's Estates and Queen's Library staff. They've put a lot of work into making sure that this exhibition was able to come together. So thank you to Alan Munro from Estates and to Jane O'Neill and Christine Carruthers from the library. They've been really enthusiastic about this project from the start, and we really appreciate their support and time. And from me, I want to say a huge thank you to Roberta and Briege from the Conflict Textiles Archive. It's been a really great experience bringing this exhibition together, and I'm so delighted that we have it now at Queen's. So Roberta is going to speak a bit more about the textiles themselves shortly. This is a permanent rotating exhibition at Queen's, so the 4 textiles we have in place now will be there for some months, and then in time they will be changed to a range of other textiles. So as I mentioned, Roberta will say a little bit more about the textiles, but I just want to touch on the significance of the textiles in terms of our teaching. So the textiles explore issues of political prisoners, torture, the use of drones, and also extraordinary rendition. So these issues and themes are relevant to a number of schools in the faculty. So in the School of Law, the themes and issues explored in the textiles are of particular relevance to modules on our LLM in criminology and criminal justice, and also our LLM in human rights. And the topics, I would imagine, will also be of relevance for students in social sciences, history, anthropology, and politics, for example. So for me, I really hope that by having this permanent rotating exhibition in the library, that it will be a resource for academic staff across the university, especially perhaps, I guess, in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, so that academic staff across different disciplines can draw on it in their teaching. And I think there's an opportunity here to think creatively about how the conflict textiles might be incorporated into our teaching. There is, of course, also, I guess, a sort of broader educational function here. So having these 4 textiles in the library and in quite a prominent position draws attention to various forms of violence and harm that are happening today across the world. So as I mentioned, the textiles explore drone warfare and extraordinary rendition. The textile on torture focuses on the Chilean dictatorship, but as we know, torture is still perpetrated across the world. And also the imprisonment or detention of political opponents and human rights activists is still a hugely important issue. So this exhibition highlights these continuing harms. Finally, a note from me on visiting the exhibition. So due to COVID, the Macleay Library is currently open, but only for essential use. So for now, I would encourage you not to visit the library just to see the exhibition. If you're using the library anyway, please go and take a look. The exhibition is just past the main reception on your way to the short loan collection. But otherwise, please hold off until the library is fully open again. So I just want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I'm going to hand over to Professor Brandon Humber.
Okay, well, thanks. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Brandon.
Oh, great. Okay. Right. Well, thank you. And thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to be with you today. And congratulations on the exhibition. It's really important, this launch today, the International Day for the Right to Truth concerning gross human rights violations and for the dignity of victims. So I think it's a very fitting day. And so I just wanted to extend my congratulations. It's more than a decade since Roberta asked me to transport a textile in the boot of my car to an exhibition that was taking place up in Derry. And at that moment in time, I would never have guessed that, and I don't know if Roberta would have, that from that very first textile, it would have grown into the massive international resource and project that it has become. And at Ulster University, we work with Roberta really closely and have for a long time. And also with my chair, and I sometimes, I don't really say it publicly very often, and I'm now about to say it, but I generally have two jobs. I work at the university, and then I work with Roberta and Conflict Textiles. So let that be a warning to you as you launch this exhibition, that this will be the first of many things. And for me, it's a deeply, deeply rewarding partnership. And so I'm very grateful, Roberta. There are other partners, particularly, Lauren, you mentioned the Following the Footsteps Ulster Museum has been really key. And so it's really fantastic, actually, to have a new member to this large global network in the form of Queen's and your Human Rights Centre, and of course the Mitchell Institute. So I see that as a really positive development. Conflict Textiles is the home of nearly 370 arpilleras at this stage from Chile and all over the world, and you highlighted a couple of them. It's the primary resource for arpilleras internationally. The physical collection is also matched with the digital repository hosted by Kane at Ulster University. It's a fully searchable database. It's a great resource. You mentioned students. It's a fantastic resource for anybody researching or wanting to learn more. And most importantly, I think Conflict Textiles is really an outreach and an engagement process. And then I see today as just another part of that growing engagement. I know Roberta keeps tabs on the number of events, but I'm sure it's well over 200 at this stage, is it not, that have taken place with activists and artists and researchers and writers from all over the world. And Conflict Textiles website alone gets more than 1,000 unique visitors a month. So this is a massive endeavor, and as I say, I'm really delighted that we're all now connected through this. Others will talk to the collection that you've started off with, so I might not mention those, but just by way of ending off, why I think the Conflict Textiles is important. Lauren, you've highlighted, of course, the learning and the academic component. For me, the Conflict Textiles tell stories. They're narratives. They're forms of testimony in their own right. They tell stories of people who often don't have voices. And I hope through this launch and the partnership, some of the experiences that have flowed for us will flow as well, which have been, for example, having families of the disappeared from all over the world online talking about their experiences. And I know you were at that event, Lauren, and it was quite phenomenal. And I also think that they serve as a form of community mobilization. They are also a way of breaking denial about human rights violations, which is really important. And the last part of that, and I'll end with this, is they make connections. And a lot of that's because of Roberta, but they make connections between the people who work on them together. They make connections between countries, and Roberta's facilitated lots of different workshops linking different countries together. And I want to end on that idea of connection, because I think what once again we have here is another set of connections that will just keep growing. We have a permanent exhibition in the McGee Library up at Ulster. This is now its twin in some ways, and that's a valuable connection and partnership that I think sometimes we're not always very good at doing. And so I want to thank Roberta for making that new connection. I want to thank Lauren and Cheryl and others from Queen's for their interest in putting this exhibition together, and also for their ongoing scholarship and work in this area, which is really important. And so I really look forward to us all going forward together, and this rotating exhibition, seeing what comes up next. And it's a really important global resource. So congratulations to everyone, and thanks for giving me a little bit of time to say something.
Thank you so much, Brandon, and thank you for joining us today. It's really valuable to hear your experiences of being involved with Conflict Textiles. I'll hand over to Roberta now to say a little bit more about the 4 textiles that we've selected. And I will mute myself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Well, I won't say all the thank yous because they have been said, just to reinforce the idea of a team. And we are a very small team, but I also have a very big thank you to Gillian Robinson that trusted in us, and from 2008 very silently was facilitating the process to grow from a very static archive to become and create a special database that we can all share and use, and who keeps us all updated on what we are doing through Twitter every day. So I today would like to show a bit who we are by sharing my screen. Can you see it now?
Yeah, I think it's just coming through. Oh, it's not. It sometimes takes a little second. Oh,
can you see it now?
Yes, we briefly saw my giant face, but yes, we're on the website now.
I will be very, very brief just to say that this is our entrance to the website, and you can see the different elements we have of who we are, what we do, the search engine that will guide you to the amount and list the events we have, and we can classify them by types, exhibitions, colloquiums, different things, and who commissioned them, in what year, and the venues. And keywords, when we don't remember exactly the year, we can keep a word. And I think Brandon went very well with the number, because if we list events, we have 200. So that's the events that we have held since 2008, and that we have thoroughly documented every exhibition with every activity. And it also gives you the possibility to go to the search engine with the list of textiles fully documented. We have 373, and very soon, in the next week or two, we'll have 374. So the process of documenting, and each piece that we document has been exhibited at least once in an exhibition. And our website also allows you to go to our Twitter and to our Conflict Textiles playlist with several short films we have done, or others, interviews that might be of use. I would also want today to go to our exhibition today, and if we go to events, we have that today, at the same time, 2 new exhibitions have started as current, and one is our Conflict Textiles collection at Macleay Library at Queen's University. What we were doing yesterday as a team was to set up, and that's the background you could see for Lauren this morning, and that's us very satisfied at the end of the process that today, with the restrictions of COVID, every single installation is a work of art in itself, because so many variables have to be considered, and moments and adjustments and distances. But here you are. We have the full 4 pieces and the wall at the entrance. You can read more at your own leisure, but I will stop now in the 4 pieces that we have on display. And they were very finely curated to be able to show different things that are important in the subject, but also from the point of view of conflict textiles, because the collection aims at showing not necessarily the events of human rights violations or the act of who the perpetrator was. It really focuses on the social tissue and the effect that those violations have had in the families, in the social broader sense, and globally. Now, the first piece we have here is called Día de Visita, Day of Visit. And can you see it well?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Here you can see what we call an arpillera of first generation. This arpillera was made by Victoria Diaz, a woman who has made several of these pieces, but they emerge of a personal experience. It's like a painting, a photograph of she actually going with her mother to visit the brother who was imprisoned, and her father was a disappeared person. So it's made the need of communicating, sharing, and this was done during the dictatorship in Chile. So we call it first generation because it comes as a direct testimony of a lived experience in which very often people have no voice. They cannot voice it. But one of the main important things for the people who are making them is to be able to act upon the injustices that have happened. If we go to, and this is in the order we have put them on the wall, we go to this piece called Cuatro Alamos Torture Center. And this is what I call a third generation arpillera, made by a Chilean woman, an arpillerista, who lived the experience of the dictatorship. She started to make arpilleras in 1986, but she has continued documenting elements of what happened. And this is post-truth commission, when Chile recognized over 1,200 torture centers. So she has here depicted one, and she made this in 2014 for an exhibition we were having. So it comes from the testimony she heard from a relative of a person who was in this detention center, and Cuatro Alamos is the name that the 4 trees that some of the tortured people could see. So that was one of the ways in which they could recognize the place. And the importance of that is that this public recognition that torture was something happening on institutionally allowed to voice further. And then the third piece we have today is digital death. And the relevance of this is that Deborah Stockdale, an artist that has worked with Conflict Textiles from the very beginning and who keeps the collection in form, and she checks the pieces. And for this exhibition, we had to work a full day to make the pieces a bit smaller in their backings because of the space we had. But this started with a conversation in my home with a pacifist person who runs the Anglican fellowship. And we were thinking that today wars are fought in different ways and how we could portray what is happening, in which it's not necessarily person to person, but there is somebody in the computer guiding the drones that go to the villages and destroy the villages, kill the people. And in this one, you can see a girl, the only survivor of a full family. So this is what we call a arpillera, or a textile of fourth generation. It's made by artists or people designing textile art connected to conflict that respond to specific topics and engage to our exhibitions and our issues. And so that you can understand how a piece gets made, I would like to draw your attention to Shannonwatch. And Shannonwatch was done in 2011. And if you look at the piece, you will see all the exhibitions where it has been. And it was really done and brought to the V&A for an exhibition called Disobedient Objects, where it got really massive exposure and went then to Australia. And we will now have today Deborah Stockdale to speak to this piece, how she conceived it. So thank you everybody for being here. And tomorrow we are launching at 1:30 an exhibition with the War Resisters League and the War Resisters International, an exhibition of nonviolent action to mark the centenary of the pacifist movement. So thank you very much. And now, Deborah, to you. Thank you. How to get out?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Well, I'd like to speak to the piece called Shannonwatch, Extraordinary Rendition. This is an arpillera that I made that was inspired by the Shannonwatch Peace Camp at Shannon Airport in Ireland. As some of you may know, Ireland is a neutral country, but it has a few exceptions to that rule, and one of that is that American military aircraft and troops have landing rights without immigration or controls at Shannon Airport. So this has been taking place since World War II, but in the past 30 years, there's been an active peace action at the gates of the airport. And I came to this piece through my reading about extraordinary rendition, which is the movement of political prisoners through this airport without controls or any kind of external moderation. So prisoners were being taken from Iraq and Afghanistan and different conflict zones to places like Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, which was had an American military base. And there was no controls over this. So this is my starting point of that. So in this picture, we can see the peace camp at the roundabout. If we could see the next slide, please. These were the actual protesters, and for one of their actions several years ago, they dressed in white burqas, the traditional dress of Afghani women, to highlight that there were over 9,000 civilian casualties, most of them women and children, in the bombing raids in Afghanistan during that time of conflict. Next picture, please. This is the protesters set up in the roundabout, and their actual signs, and they held vigil there, and they had a campground for several nights before the police moved them on. Next picture, please. So this is the interpretation of the peace camp. Next, please. You can see that Shannon is a duty-free zone. Well, it was also a military stop-off. So I think it was a very brave action for these people to actually set up and demonstrate there for all these years. And it's an ongoing protest. Next, please. A close-up of the arpillera with the peace camp. Next, please. And then the next, please. This is the airport and detail. So this is how I came to this piece through the actions of the Shannonwatch Peace Camp and my interest in extraordinary rendition. As Roberta said, this has traveled widely, and probably over 3 million people saw it between London and Sydney, and opened up a dialogue about the use of this airport for military activities in an otherwise neutral country. Well, thank you for your time. I hope if you have any questions, please ask afterwards. Goodbye.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm really delighted that you could join us today to give us some insight into one of the textiles. And thank you, Roberta, also for that overview of the rest of the exhibition. So I'm going to invite Dr. Cheryl Lawther to speak now. Cheryl is the director of the Human Rights Centre, and the Human Rights Centre has funded the installation along with the Mitchell Institute. Thank you, Cheryl.
Morning, everybody. Thank you, Lauren. As Lauren said, I'm Cheryl Lawther. I am the director of the Human Rights Centre here at Queen's. And here at the Human Rights Centre, we're very pleased to welcome the Conflict Textiles exhibition. It's an incredibly innovative piece of work, and it's a testament to its creators, some of whom are with us today, but also, and I think most importantly, to those victims and survivors of human rights violations who have shared something of their own experiences with us. As you've heard this morning, the exhibition is located in the Macleay Library at Queen's, and we hope that it will become a talking point for students and staff, and will highlight not only the different forms that human rights violations can take, but the ways in which human rights and the ways in which human rights violations can be approached and campaigned from a variety of different vantage points. I think what is perhaps even more significant is today, as Brandon said earlier, is the International Day for the Right to Truth. And some of the stated purposes of the International Day for the Right to Truth are to honour the memory of victims of gross and systematic human rights violations, and to promote the importance of the right to truth and justice, but also to pay tribute to those who have devoted their lives to, and in some cases lost their lives, in the struggle to promote and protect the human rights of all. As you've already heard this morning, the Conflict Textiles exhibition speaks to many of these values. And as such, its launch here in Northern Ireland, a society which, as you know, continues to struggle to facilitate truth, justice and information recovery for victims and survivors. That launch today on the International Day for the Right to Truth could not be more timely. So I'll keep my comments brief. In short, we are delighted to welcome this exhibition, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Lauren and Roberta and everybody else who has made this possible. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you for being so enthusiastic about the project. I'm really delighted that it's at Queen's. Okay, so next we have Professor Kieran McAvoy, who's going to speak today as a representative of the Mitchell Institute. Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, colleagues. I'm delighted here to be representing the Mitchell Institute. I think, as most of you will be aware, the Mitchell Institute is a centre based at Queen's designed to promote interdisciplinary research and collaboration on issues of conflict. I think at Queen's for a number of years, we realized that lots of us were working on different aspects of conflict and conflict transformation, but that we were doing it in our disciplinary silos. So lawyers were doing their thing, sociologists were doing their thing, political scientists were doing their thing, and so forth. So the idea was to set up somewhere that we could bring together the energy basically from within the university on that. I'm particularly delighted to be working with our colleagues at the University of Ulster in collaborating around this. Brandon and I have worked together for years on aspects of transitional justice and legacy-related matters, and I think neither of us have any time for petty rivalries between the two institutions. So this is a lovely opportunity for us to work together, and of course to work together with our and collaborate with our colleagues from the Conflict Textiles exhibition. It does also offer an opportunity, I think, to stimulate discussions and conversations within the university itself, which is why it appeals, I think, directly to us at the Mitchell Institute. As Lauren said earlier, the issues of political prisoners, torture, rendition, drone warfare. We have people across the university who are working on all of these issues, and we have students who are learning about them in our undergrad programs, our master's programs, and indeed doing PhDs. So I certainly will be encouraging all the students that I teach and interact with to go to the library. I was back in the library this morning actually, and I had another look at the exhibition. It's brilliant. It's really interesting. It totally draws you in. And I think, as I say, from students and colleagues from across the disciplines, if they take the time to go over there and have a look at it, it will draw them in. For my sins, I'm a lawyer, and lawyers have a reputation, perhaps well-deserved, for being a little bit boring at times, and also a little bit precious and a little bit obsessed with our own discipline, and thinking that, particularly in terms of dealing with the legacy of conflict and human rights violations, thinking that law and legalism brings all of the answers. And I personally, as a lawyer, and probably certainly in my earlier career, probably would have been a bit infected with that view of the world. I've been genuinely inspired by this kind of memory work. A number of years ago, myself and my colleague Louise Mander, along with Kath Collins from Ulster, were in Chile as part of a bigger project that we were looking at the role that lawyers play in both conflict, authoritarianism, and moving out of conflict. And Kath took us to number 38 Londres Street in Santiago, which, as most of you will probably be aware, is a former torture centre, now a museum, which highlights the human rights abuses and violations that took place during the dictatorship. And there was a brilliant interactive exhibition there when we were there. And so for someone like me, as a lawyer, we were there to look at a project on lawyers, but it got me thinking about memory work. We've just finished the book from that project, and we have a whole section in there about the intersection of law as a discipline and what we as lawyers do in terms of dealing with the past, and thinking about other types of memory work and the way in which other types of memory work can complement what we do as lawyers, and also make us think more profoundly about it. I also have been involved with a local victims organisation, Relatives for Justice. I did an evaluation of them a number of years back, and they, like other victims organisations in Northern Ireland, have been involved in producing quilts, textile-based quilts, as memory work, essentially working with families. And again, the power of that kind of an exhibition in this context, produced by families themselves and who are directly affected by conflict and by violence, and the ways in which that stimulates debate and discussion, and certainly, as I say, both in terms of that visit to Chile and also seeing the work done here by the Relatives for Justice and other victims organisations. I cannot stress any more strongly for anyone with an interest in all of these issues in human rights, and I say this particularly to any law students who are watching or any law colleagues, this is a way of shaking you out of your box, thinking about memory work beyond legalistic mechanisms like truth commissions and trials. And so I'll finish by saying this, I am delighted and profoundly proud that we at the Mitchell Institute are able to support this exhibition. So thank you for giving us the opportunity.
That's great. Thank you, Kieran, and thanks again to the Mitchell Institute. And as I noted before, Hastings Dunn, the director of the Institute, couldn't be with us today, but I want to acknowledge his enthusiasm and support for the project from its when it was just an email of me saying, "Oh, is this possible? What do we do?" So thank you to Hastings. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes now for discussion. So I invite any questions and comments from our audience. You can type your questions in the chat bar. There's a little speech bubble. For most people, it should be in the top right if you want to do that, or equally, you can use the raise hand function and turn off your mic and speak to us. So do we have any questions or comments? Oh, we have a hand up. Benjamin, do you want to come in?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can, thanks.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you to you, and thank you for all the presenters for a really interesting discussion about the really important exhibition and the work of Conflict Textiles. So my question was to, I guess, anybody who wants to answer it, and it's around sensory experiences for those who create these pieces and also for the visitors who engage with them. So we can think about how important the senses are or can be, so not just only sight, but sound, taste, touch, etc. And the importance for this in communicating and also understanding traumatic narratives. And then thinking about the importance for this for when people are creating these textiles. So obviously the textiles, in one sense, they're sight, they're a visual narrative of what someone has experienced or gone through. But then I was just wondering, do the creators of these pieces also have other sensory experiences during the kind of creating of them? So when they're touching the fabrics or when they're smelling the fabric, does that kind of stimulate other stories? And then also alongside that, when visitors are coming, are there not only the sensory experience of sight, which is obviously a big part of this, but also maybe smells of the pieces, of the fabrics themselves, but also the smells within like the library where this exhibition is, and like kind of some of those dynamics of storytelling through textiles, if that makes some sense.
Yeah, I would be happy to answer. Mm-hmm. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin. You say you have pointed out to several elements that are very, very important here. I think there is also the sense of time. The sense of time, if you imagine, it's the lived experience, it's the process of going through the traumatic experience to find a creative way to express it, to choose the design, to choose the material that quite often brings back memories. So some of the pieces are made with, especially with scraps of materials of old clothes, sometimes of a person who is missing, sometimes of a person we remember, sometimes with materials from school uniforms. So it has a many, many messages behind. They are evocative. As you say, they can also evoke smells. They can have a smell in themselves, but they can bring out smells, because it's not only about the story they tell, it's also what they bring out in the viewer, in the person who can imagine the time passing and not having justice. And if we think, even if justice is put in place, the person who is absent is not going to come back. So there is a sense of the tactile, but there is a sense of also of loss that has to be integrated to life, in the good elements of life that allow you to live with the loss. And in many of the cases, the pieces also have the value of helping the person, especially in the case of the disappeared, to do the mourning process, to start to apprehend the idea that the person is not going to come back. It helps in that element. So as you pointed out, there are so many elements, and it also gives the makers and the supporters of the makers, because the arpilleras wouldn't have left Chile if there wouldn't have been networks of women and men who brought them out, even risking their lives, to bring these testimonies out. The idea that the person who makes them thinks, I am doing something, I'm taking ownership of my process. And personally, I worked 4 years for the Second Truth Commission in Chile and took testimonies. And often the relatives or the survivors or the witnesses didn't come so much to tell the story that had already been told. They came to share the experience of impotence, that they couldn't do more, and to share how much these events had changed and reshaped their life in very difficult circumstances, and the next losses they had. So I won't go into more, but if you go and see the exhibition, or you go to our archive and you look for keywords like disappeared or torture or reconciliation, you will find pieces that will speak to that. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Roberta. Do any of our other speakers want to come in on this question on the textiles and the senses?
I can maybe say something just briefly. I can't really talk to what it's like to make them, and I'm sure it is a very tactile experience. I mean, I can just maybe reflect on saying, as somebody who's seen many of them, it's very hard not to touch them. And you know, because they're multi-layered and are not flat, it creates that sense of drawing you in, and you want to actually touch them. And I think that that's all part of the process of bringing you into the story and bringing you into the testimony. And I think that that's one of the main reasons why they actually work. So yeah, I just wanted to make that observation, because I've had that sensation so many times where you just want to put your hand onto it, and sometimes even with quite traumatic things. So some of the images on some of them might show you know, made out of cloth, somebody who's actually been killed, and there's like a little piece of red blood or something, and you sort of feel the need to sort of recognize it by touching it. Of course, only when Roberta's not looking. But I think it creates that three-dimensional space which wants you to bring it in, and definitely has something tactile in that regard. And the smell, Roberta's right, they all have slightly different smells as well.
If I could add a very short thing, if you want to have the experience of seeing the actual textiles in the flesh, as my colleague from the V&A calls them, on the 31st of August, when we mark the 10th anniversary of the Day of the Disappeared, we will have an open day at the Ulster Museum, where we will have part of the pieces in a room on display as part of the Troubles and Beyond, but in another room we will have pieces in which we will be able to show the pieces front and back and talk about them, and with some gloves we will be able even to touch them. So thank you for calling your attention to that, Brandon.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Roberta and Brandon, and thank you, Benjamin, for that question. It's a really interesting thing to think about. Deborah, do you want to come in on this?
Okay, can you hear me? I just want to speak to that. Having made more than one textile that involved fabric belonging to a deceased person, both personally and also as an arpillera, there's something very final and somewhat cathartic about actually cutting into something to make something new out of it. I made a memorial quilt for my brother out of his big and varied collection of Hawaiian shirts. And it took me well over a year after he passed away to actually make those first cuts into his clothing. And in doing so, it was an acknowledgement of the grief and the fact that he would not be coming back to wear his shirts. So, you know, I can imagine that was my experience, and it is probably echoed in many arpilleristas' use of clothing or domestic textiles like a tablecloth or napkins or bandages. In one case, in one of the Argentinian arpilleras, was created from the bandage of a disappeared person. It's a final reckoning and also a way of resolution and moving on. So it's a very profound thing. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for sharing that powerful reflection. And yes, I would encourage anyone, Roberta has already shown you the search function on the website, but beyond the 4 textiles exhibited at Queen's, I would encourage you to go and have a look on there, and that use of the bandages is very powerful. Do we have any other questions? I'll just check the chat. Okay. Oh, sorry, Carla, would you like to come in?
And just to recognize Carla's, oh, maybe she will say herself who she is. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor and the remarkable presentations today. And thank you, Roberta. I'm the new ambassador of Chile to Ireland. I'll say new because I arrived a year ago, but just before lockdown. So I've been basically not being able to meet many of you that I wish to meet. I just want to say that this is without a doubt a very remarkable work, and we very much admire the work that Roberta has been doing for many years. She's a great collaborator of our embassy as well. She has presented many times here her pieces with great generosity, and in other places or the other venues here in Dublin as well. But I just wanted to say that you really have a great treasure in your hands in this exhibition. So thank you. And we want to also mention that without a doubt, these emotional testimonies has a great value. And as Roberta mentioned, they were smuggled at that time to other countries were known during the period of dictatorship. They were exhibited and very much valued in many places. And of course, they give a very powerful testimony for a very sad chapter of the history of Chile. And they really give a voice to many people, particularly women, who were suffering human rights violation or their families. So we thank you for the opportunity as well. And I'm very happy to hear that there are so many people interested and have continued to work in memory and other collaborations with my country. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you for your comments, and thank you for joining us today. Do we have any other questions?
Sorry, can I come in again?
Yes, you can.
Just to respond to Carla, I'm really grateful you are there. And just to say that the first exhibition we had at the Chilean embassy in London, when Patricio Dam was the consul, and I asked him what the real actions of an ambassador were, and he says it's like an arpillera. We bring part of our recent history to light to other countries, but we also, by doing that, animate other countries to look at our past and our history and engage. And I think it has had a big impact. That was 2008, because from then on, the work we have done in other countries has been to mirror, to respond in their own context. So for Northern Ireland, we have now a quite significant collection of arpilleras made after looking at Chilean arpilleras, but connecting it to the issues that have happened in this country during the Troubles. So I say that this function of being ambassadorial and influencing and giving, facilitating other new creative ways to express and connect to the fact that Conflict Textiles has been able to connect to accounts of the conflict and recognize textile language as a legitimate way to register violent experiences during conflict. And Accounts of the Conflict archive has now 10 textiles from Northern Ireland that would be recognized as the same value as an oral or written testimony. So I would also invite you through those pieces to connect directly to the National Archive. So thank you very much, Carla, to trigger this response to you. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Roberta. We have no, are there any further questions? I see no more hands up, so I will, I'll ask one actually, I guess, just to pull together some of what's already been touched on today, but obviously we're here on the International Day for the Right to Truth, and Roberta, you spoke about briefly about your work with the Chilean Truth Commission and the issue of ownership of a person's story. So perhaps could you say a bit more about the intersection of textiles and truth-telling? Perhaps particularly, do they have a role in providing a sort of platform for voices that might be excluded or overlooked by formal truth recovery mechanisms?
Well, they have, it's very palpable. And it's the recognition that you communicate the way you can do it in a sensorial way, because the events have not only affected your emotional pain, but it also triggers this desperate need to act. And the sewing with the need, especially most of the Chilean arpilleras are only done with scraps of material, needle and thread. The persistence of the pain and the persistence of dealing with it, the needle in and the needle out. And also recognize that you have to listen to the organizations and groups and people who have suffered at the local basis. It's not only about creating new institutions that will study the papers that are in courts. It is to see what has happened to the people, to give them ownership, but that is part of the reparation, to feel that you are listened, that your story is valid, and that what you are saying is the truth, because you always knew that you were telling the truth, but you were told that this didn't happen. So this public acknowledgement is really vital, and the textiles gives you the idea to preserve them. So we as an archive have also struggled a lot to turn this live archive in something palpable, but that we also give the value to preserving it. It's not just to make it and then we go to the next one. Each piece we have is preserved. We have pieces that date from 1905, and then from the dictatorship, many. This idea that we always preserve, there is always part of the history that we keep, and from that we build on, and we would like to recognize it as possible and for the present, and also to move into the future.
Thank you, Roberta. Does anyone else want to come in on the truth question about textiles as a vehicle for sort of lesser heard voices, I guess? Okay, I'll just check for any further questions.
There is a nice comment from Eileen Harrison, who has made several textiles herself, and our collection has documented and exhibited widely 2 of them. So maybe if you could read that.
Yes, I will. So yes, Eileen says, hello, I'm Eileen Harrison. I just wanted to say that I find the rhythms of hand stitch lead to words which also lead into musical cadences. So for me, the stitch is a multidisciplinary and multi-sensory experience. So that speaks to Benjamin, your question from earlier on. Okay, we have no further questions, so by a small miracle, we're going to finish on time. So I would like to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers for today, and thank you to all of our participants, and thanks for the questions and comments that we received. By way of reminder, with regards to the specific exhibition, unfortunately due to COVID, the library is only open for essential purposes. So if you're in the library to get books or to work there, please go and take a look. And otherwise, if you don't have to go in, if you could please hold off until it's a bit more open. And I know a number of our guests today are not based either at Queen's or in Northern Ireland, so I will post the link to the Conflict Textiles website, and you can see the images there and a bit of description on each of the textiles. But thank you everyone for joining us, and that is us for today. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.